For centuries, the resting place of King Solomon existed somewhere between history and legend. Ancient texts described a ruler surrounded by impossible wealth, forbidden knowledge, and secrets said to be buried with him. Most historians believed the tomb had been lost forever. But when a sealed chamber was reportedly uncovered beneath layers of forgotten stone, what investigators claimed to find inside raised a darker question. Was Solomon remembered as a wise king, or had history hidden something far more unsettling? Long before the world began treating King Solomon as a symbol of mystery, he was remembered as a man whose name carried unusual weight even in his own lifetime. In ancient records, he was not described simply as a ruler. He was described as a king people traveled across deserts to see. Leaders from distant lands were said to have stood in his court just to hear him speak. They did not come because of war. They came because they believed he understood something other men did not. That alone made him different. Most kings of the ancient world were remembered for conquest. Their stories were built on blood, fear, and land taken by force. Solomon's story moved in another direction. He was remembered for judgment, for intelligence, and for an ability to settle impossible disputes with a few carefully chosen words. Even centuries later, his reputation survived in religious texts, oral traditions, and scattered historical writings that refused to let his name disappear. But the deeper historians looked, the more unusual his story became. According to tradition, Solomon inherited a united kingdom at a fragile moment. His father, King David, had built a powerful throne, but power in the ancient world rarely stayed stable for long. Enemies watched from outside the borders. Rivalries waited inside the palace walls. Many believed the young ruler would struggle to hold everything together. Instead, stories say he turned a vulnerable kingdom into one of the richest courts in the ancient Near East. Gold reportedly flowed into Jerusalem in amounts that sounded almost impossible. Ivory, rare wood, gemstones, and exotic animals were said to arrive from foreign lands. Merchants carried stories of a palace filled with wealth that seemed beyond imagination. To some, it sounded like history. To others, it sounded like myth. And that was where the line first began to blur. Because Solomon was never remembered as only a king. He became something larger. Ancient writings described him as a man who could understand nature itself. Some texts claimed he knew the language of animals. Others said he studied the movement of the stars. In later traditions, his wisdom expanded into something even more mysterious. He was no longer seen as merely intelligent. He was portrayed as someone who possessed knowledge hidden from ordinary men. That idea changed everything. Because once history begins turning a man into a legend, facts become harder to separate from fear. Some believed Solomon's wisdom came from divine blessing. Others believed his knowledge came from forbidden sources. Over time, stories spread that he possessed ancient writings, sacred objects, and secret teachings that were never meant to leave his private chambers. In some traditions, he was even linked to supernatural power, as though wisdom itself had opened doors that should have remained closed. For generations, people argued over what was real. Some scholars saw him as a brilliant ruler whose story had been exaggerated over centuries. Others believed there may have been truths hidden inside those old accounts that modern historians were too quick to dismiss. The problem was simple. Very little physical evidence ever appeared that could firmly connect the man to the legend. And without evidence, Solomon remained trapped between belief and doubt. That uncertainty only made the mystery stronger. The more his kingdom faded into the past, the more people became obsessed with what may have been left behind. Ancient rulers often buried wealth with their dead. Some were laid to rest with crowns, weapons, and sacred treasures meant to protect them in the afterlife. But with Solomon, the rumors became darker. Stories began to suggest that his burial place held more than riches. It may have held secrets. Some believed sacred scrolls were hidden with him. Others believed rare artifacts vanished after his death and were placed inside a sealed chamber known only to a handful of trusted men. A few ancient traditions claimed the tomb itself was deliberately concealed, not to protect the king, but to protect the world from what was buried beside him. That was the detail that never stopped haunting historians. Why would a king known for wisdom need to disappear so completely? Because despite thousands of years of searching, no confirmed tomb of Solomon was ever found. Empires rose and collapsed. Cities were destroyed and rebuilt. Entire civilizations vanished into dust. Yet the one place many believed should have survived in history seemed to leave no clear trace at all. That absence became its own kind of evidence. Some researchers believed the tomb had simply been lost through time. Others suspected something very different. They believed the burial site may have been intentionally hidden by those closest to him. If that was true, then the mystery was not about whether Solomon was buried. It was about why someone wanted the location erased. And that question changed how people saw the story. Because hidden tombs are one thing. Hidden history is something else entirely. By the modern era, many scholars had become cautious whenever Solomon's name appeared in dramatic claims. Too many false discoveries had surfaced over the years. Too many treasure hunters had used his name to attract attention. Every few decades, someone claimed to have found proof. And every time, the evidence fell apart under closer examination. That made many experts skeptical. But skepticism never stopped public fascination. Even people who knew very little about ancient history recognized the name. Solomon had become larger than archaeology. He had become part of something deeper, the human need to believe that some stories survive because they contain a truth no one has fully uncovered yet. And few stories carried that feeling more strongly than his. Because the mystery was never just about where he was buried. It was about what people believed might still be waiting there. Was it treasure? Was it knowledge? Or was it something later generations were never supposed to see? For centuries, no one could answer that. And eventually, many believed no one ever would. But far beneath layers of stone that had remained untouched for ages, something unexpected was beginning to change that story. For centuries, the search for King Solomon had ended the same way. Fragments of rumor would surface. Ancient maps would be studied. Forgotten ruins would draw attention for a few brief weeks. Then the excitement would collapse under the same hard truth. There was never enough evidence to prove anything. Solomon's tomb remained one of history's most famous missing places, spoken about more often than it was seriously believed. That was why few people paid attention at first. The site had already been known to local researchers for years. It was an aging stretch of stone buried beneath layers of earth, damaged by time, weather, and centuries of conflict. To most people, it looked no different from dozens of other ancient sites scattered across the region. Broken walls, cracked foundations, dust that had not moved in generations. Nothing about it seemed extraordinary. At least not on the surface. The team working there was not searching for a lost king. Their original goal was much smaller. They were studying the remains of an older structure that appeared to have been built in stages over different centuries. It was the kind of careful archaeological work that rarely made headlines. Slow excavation, patient cataloging, quiet analysis. Then one scan changed everything. Ground-penetrating equipment reportedly revealed an empty space below a collapsed section of stone near the deepest part of the site. At first, no one treated it as a major discovery. Hidden cavities beneath ancient ruins were not unusual. Most turned out to be drainage systems, storage rooms, or chambers that had already been looted long ago. But this one looked different. The shape was too deliberate. Instead of a rough hollow space, the scan showed what appeared to be a rectangular chamber with walls that seemed unnaturally precise. The structure did not match the architecture around it. Its angles were cleaner. Its position was deeper. And most importantly, it appeared completely sealed. That detail stopped the team. Ancient chambers were often sealed from the outside to keep intruders away. This one seemed to have been sealed from within. The stone blocking the narrow entrance appeared to have been placed in a way that suggested someone had closed it from inside the chamber itself. That made no sense. And that was when the site stopped feeling routine. At first, the researchers tried to remain cautious. Archaeology had a long history of false excitement. One unusual discovery could quickly become exaggerated once rumors reached the outside world. The team understood that. They knew how quickly speculation could outrun evidence. So they kept the discovery quiet. Only a small number of specialists were told what had been found beneath the stone. Additional scans were ordered. Measurements were repeated. Every effort was made to confirm that the hollow space was real before any physical digging continued. But each new result pointed to the same conclusion. There was something down there. And it had been hidden for a very long time. As workers began clearing debris by hand, more strange details emerged. Several stones near the lower section carried markings that had not been visible before. They were faint, nearly erased by time. But some appeared carved rather than natural. Symbols, lines, fragments of ancient writing worn almost smooth by centuries underground. That was when whispers began. Some members of the team believed the symbols resembled inscriptions connected to royal structures from the First Temple period. Others warned that making such a connection so early could destroy the credibility of the entire excavation. The name of Solomon was already dangerous in archaeology. It attracted attention before facts could catch up. Still, the possibility could not be ignored. Because if the dating was correct, the chamber had been sealed during a period that aligned closely with the era traditionally associated with Solomon's reign. That alone was enough to create tension. Inside the excavation team, opinions quickly divided. Some believed they were standing above an ordinary burial site. Others believed the chamber could be part of something much larger, a hidden section of a structure that had somehow escaped destruction while everything around it disappeared. And the deeper they dug, the stranger it became. The entrance itself was narrower than expected. Instead of a visible doorway, the chamber appeared hidden behind a wall of fitted stone designed to blend into the surrounding foundation. It was not merely buried by time. It looked concealed by design. Someone had wanted this room forgotten. That possibility changed the mood of the entire site. Excavations that had once felt academic began to feel personal. Workers reportedly became quieter. Some refused to speak about the chamber after dark. Others dismissed that as nerves, the kind of tension that always follows an important find. But even among the skeptics, the atmosphere had changed. Because history was beginning to feel close. And no one yet knew what kind of history it was. As the final outer stones were slowly removed, a thin opening appeared between the ancient blocks. Cold air moved through the gap. Air that had been trapped inside for centuries. Some said the moment felt unforgettable. Others later described it as deeply unsettling. Because sealed chambers are not supposed to breathe. That single detail spread quickly through the site. Even before the chamber was opened, rumors began escaping beyond the excavation. Local workers told family members. Word reached nearby scholars. Then journalists started asking questions. Within days, a quiet archaeological dig had become the center of international speculation. And one name was suddenly being spoken again. Solomon. Most experts publicly urged caution. They reminded reporters that many ancient discoveries had been wrongly linked to famous biblical figures before. Without inscriptions, artifacts, or direct proof, no responsible archaeologist could make that claim. But privately, some admitted the same thing. They had never seen a chamber like this before. The architecture was unusual. The seal was unusual. And the location itself raised questions no one could easily answer. Why had this chamber been built beneath an older ruin instead of inside a known royal burial ground? Why was the entrance hidden so carefully? And why did every new layer seem to suggest that whoever sealed it wanted more than protection? They wanted silence. By then, anticipation had begun replacing skepticism. Cameras waited outside. Historians requested access. Religious scholars started debating what the discovery could mean before the chamber was even opened. Yet the most unsettling part had not happened yet. Because just before the team prepared to enter, they noticed one final detail carved into the inner stone near the sealed passage. And what they saw forced everyone to stop. By the time the final stone was moved, the atmosphere around the chamber had changed completely. What had started as a careful excavation now felt like something much heavier. Even the people who had spent their lives inside ancient ruins understood they were standing at the edge of a moment that could alter more than one historical timeline. Dust hung in the air. Lights were lowered into the narrow opening. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the chamber was opened. The first thing investigators noticed was not treasure. It was order. Ancient tombs that survive for centuries are often damaged by time. Walls crack. Objects collapse. Burial spaces become chaotic. But inside this chamber, early reports described something almost untouched. Items appeared arranged with unusual precision, as if the room had been prepared to preserve a message rather than simply protect a body. That detail immediately stood out. Several objects rested along the stone walls in deliberate patterns. Fragments of gold reflected faintly under artificial light. Small ceremonial vessels sat in symmetrical rows. Pieces of carved wood, darkened by age, remained near the center of the room. Nothing seemed scattered. Nothing looked accidental. It was as though someone had expected the room to be seen again. But not by just anyone. At the center of the chamber stood what looked like a raised stone platform. It was not large enough to resemble the grand sarcophagi found in later royal burials, but it was clearly meant to hold something of importance. Some believed it may once have held human remains. Others thought it may have supported a sacred object now lost to time. And that was where the uncertainty began. Because the chamber did not immediately look like an ordinary tomb. It looked like something between a burial site and a sanctuary. That distinction mattered. Researchers had expected to find clear signs of royal burial if the chamber belonged to someone of extraordinary importance. Crowns, weapons, jewelry, personal objects. Those were common markers in elite tombs across the ancient world. Instead, what appeared inside seemed far more symbolic. Many of the objects appeared ritualistic. Several small containers were found near the walls, some sealed, others broken. Their purpose was not immediately understood. Thin metal pieces were discovered stacked beside carved stone fragments. A few early descriptions mentioned engraved surfaces covered with lines of writing so old they were nearly impossible to read without preservation. And that was when excitement began spreading far beyond the site. Because some of the markings appeared familiar. Ancient language specialists called to the site reportedly noticed symbols that resembled early Hebrew forms mixed with older regional scripts. That alone was unusual. It suggested whoever created the chamber may have wanted the inscriptions understood only by certain people. Not everyone. And perhaps not immediately. The writing itself became one of the most debated parts of the discovery. Some translations appeared harmless at first. Words associated
with wisdom,
judgment, peace,
kingship. Phrases that seemed to reflect the qualities history had long attached to Solomon. But deeper inside the chamber, the language reportedly shifted. The tone became darker. Instead of praise, some inscriptions appeared to describe protection, separation, warning. One phrase allegedly repeated near the inner wall seemed to suggest that what rested in the chamber was not meant to be disturbed. That was the moment everything changed. Because until then, the story had still felt archaeological. Now it began to feel personal. Even skeptical observers admitted the chamber did not fit the normal expectations of an ancient royal site. Some believed the unusual arrangement reflected a ceremonial burial tied to spiritual tradition. Others believed the chamber may have served as a hidden archive, a place where sacred materials were concealed after a time of political danger. And then another detail emerged. Near the rear wall, partially hidden beneath fallen debris, investigators reportedly found a second recessed section inside the chamber. It was smaller than the first room and sealed behind another carved slab. The outer chamber had already raised difficult questions. The existence of a second hidden space suggested the first chamber may only have been the beginning. That possibility sent shockwaves through the team. Because if one room had been built to hide another, then the people who created it were protecting something much more valuable than ordinary burial goods. Some believed it could contain royal records. Others feared it could contain nothing at all. Because sometimes the greatest power of an ancient chamber is not what it reveals, but what it makes people imagine. News of the discovery spread quickly through international media. Headlines began appearing before experts had even completed their first analysis. Some outlets called it the possible tomb of Solomon. Others dismissed those claims as reckless speculation. Religious communities reacted with fascination. Historians urged restraint. Public curiosity exploded almost overnight. And with every new report, the mystery grew larger. Because the public was not reacting to gold. They were reacting to the idea that an ancient story long dismissed as legend might suddenly have a physical place in the real world. That possibility carried enormous weight. For generations, Solomon had lived in a strange space between faith and history. Some viewed him as a symbolic figure. Others saw him as a real king whose life had been exaggerated over time. But a chamber like this threatened to reopen questions many scholars believed would never be answered. Could parts of the old stories have been true? Could wisdom once attributed to myth have come from a real place? And if so, what else had history quietly ignored? Inside the excavation site, those questions became harder to avoid. Several members of the team later described feeling an unusual tension as they worked inside the chamber. Some dismissed it as exhaustion. Others said the silence of the room felt unnatural. In a place sealed for centuries, every sound seemed louder. Every movement felt observed. Even those who rejected superstition admitted one thing: the chamber felt different. And then attention turned back to the writing. Because as specialists continued examining the inscriptions, they began noticing something deeply unsettling. The outer walls appeared to describe wisdom, but the inner markings seemed to describe consequences. At first, the inscriptions seemed like the kind of words archaeologists often find in ancient burial sites. They spoke of remembrance, of authority, of a life that had once carried power. Those phrases were expected. Ancient rulers wanted their names to survive. They wanted future generations to understand who had been buried there. In that way, the chamber still appeared to follow a familiar pattern. But deeper inside, the language changed. The closer researchers moved toward the intersection of the chamber, the less the writing sounded like tribute, and the more it sounded like warning. Several lines carved into the stone did not describe the man who had been placed there. They described what could happen if the chamber was disturbed. That was unusual. Royal tombs in the ancient world sometimes carried threats meant to frighten grave robbers. Egypt had examples of it. Mesopotamia had examples too. Warnings could protect sacred spaces by turning fear into a barrier stronger than stone. Most were dramatic but predictable. They promised divine anger,
disease,
misfortune, judgment in the afterlife. But these markings felt more deliberate.
Instead of broad threats, the inscriptions reportedly warned about separation and boundaries never meant to be crossed. One fragment suggested that knowledge taken without understanding could lead to destruction, while another implied something was sealed away for reasons beyond death. That alone unsettled people, because the writing didn't feel like superstition. It felt like instruction. Some experts pushed back, arguing ancient language is easily misread and damaged symbols can completely change meaning. Others suggested it could simply be ritual or sacred royal text. But the discomfort wasn't only academic. People at the excavation site also felt it. Workers avoided staying near the chamber alone, and even skeptical researchers admitted the space felt unusually disturbing. The chamber itself seemed designed less like a tomb and more like something meant to contain or protect whatever lay deeper inside. That raised a key question. What was so important it needed to be sealed this way? Ancient traditions linked King Solomon to wisdom and hidden knowledge, and suddenly the idea that the warnings were protecting knowledge, not treasure, gained attention. Outside the site, speculation exploded. Some called it sacred writings, others feared a secret too sensitive to reveal. Inside, researchers stayed cautious, reminding everyone there was no confirmed curse, only interpretation and emotion. Still, one fact remained. The chamber was intentionally sealed. And behind it, another hidden section still waited unopened. That meant the real mystery had only just begun.